Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 134. We actually have a current CSP staff member who's been a CSP lifer, really important contributor to the success we've had, so I'm excited to highlight some of his expertise. This topic actually started out as a guest post he submitted to publish on my website, and I read it over, and when I got to the end, I realized this could be a much better podcast. I think there are a lot of follow-up questions that I wanted to answer that I thought he could illustrate really, really well with his responses. So I threw it his way and he was all about it. So we're going to get some really good information on what makes a fastball elite. So stay tuned. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. 1 scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients to the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey. Today's guest serves as Associate Pitching Coordinator at Cressey Sports Performance, Florida. He was a client at CSP throughout his high school and college careers. Growing up in Palm Beach County, he attended the Benjamin School and went on to play Division I baseball at Wofford College in South Carolina. Following his college career, he became a strength and conditioning intern at CSP Florida during the 2020-21 offseason. This strength and conditioning experience gave him a unique perspective from which to apply principles of movement to both the pitching delivery and the pitching analytics world. Prior to returning to joining the CSP staff, he was the pitching coach for Cardinal Newman High School and a player development associate for the Philadelphia Phillies for the 2021 season. Well-versed for athletes and clients of all ages and ability levels, he's our resident expert with coaching, throwing, and our youngest athletes, and takes particular pride in making training fun and engaging in these youth players. Above all else, he's become an important asset to us as we work with high school, college, and professional athletes. So we're excited to welcome to the show, Matt Ellmyer. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Eric.
I was thinking about this before we came on. I know we had like Packy on here. We've had Tyler Beatty, a lot of the guys that you've worked with over the years who were high school athletes with us, who are now pro athletes. But I think you're the first ever high school athlete who went on, became a college athlete, then became a staff member, and then came on the podcast. So you're in an elite company.
Yeah, CSP for life, man. Been doing it for a while.
I like it. John O'Neill was a college athlete, but he was never a high school athlete with us. So we're pushing the bar higher on long-term development here. So, but with that said, we're talking fastballs today, and I know we've had some really good conversations on it, and you've taken some really deep dives with this, and certainly baseball's kind of headed in some interesting directions. So let's dig in on it. So fastball usage has been trending down across baseball for several years now. So I think first off, let's talk about the rationale for why that adjustment is taking place? Is it because guys have nastier secondary pitches than ever, or is it simply that hitters they're training against velocity more than ever before, and they're therefore more equipped to handle fastballs a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely both to an extent. Just looking from like the hitter's lens, like the hitter's always looking for a fastball. It's the overwhelming majority of the way that they train. And they're getting more and more realistic with the way they're doing it, with velocity, more realistic movement, the angle the ball approaches home plate. So definitely kudos to the hitters that they're getting better with like improved training methodologies. But also like secondary pitchers are definitely getting nastier too. And I think that's just a testament to like the improvement in technology within the last like 7-8 years ish, where like we're actually able to like quantify what movement is, like whether something's effective or not. And we now have the ability to be able to make a decision like, oh, we should do this with an off speed pitch, and that will make it bigger, smaller, a little bit more effective in this way, a little bit less effective in that way. And we can get into some of the minutia that we haven't really been able to do before in the past. And I think that brings us to like the main reason why, because like just effectiveness in general, like looking at like the vast majority of like all pitches thrown in 2021 in the MLB season last year, the expected WOBA, which is basically a fancier batting average, a little bit more in-depth batting average statistic, against fastballs was 334. And then when you look at the expected WOBA against every other pitch throughout the league, it's 271. And I think like the more we get into this, the more we have an idea of like, hey, if you do something well, you should do it more often. And I think it's starting to like take place in the big leagues, and especially across other levels of the game, where guys are like, oh wait, like this pitch is really good, it's really effective, I'm gonna throw it more, and they've seen some good results with it.
Do you think some of like the anti, I guess fastball bias to some degree is happening because it gets a bad rap in that it's the pitch that you often throw when you're behind in counts, and it's typically the pitch that people can command the absolute best. They're forced to use it in maybe less than opportune times.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I've personally, like, I mean, the amount of 3-0 fastballs I threw as a player, and I can imagine for the vast majority of other guys, like when you get behind the count, you wanna get back in there, and more times than not, the heater's the one to command it.
Absolutely. And I guess maybe as a parallel to that first question is like, do you think on the whole that there are times when people are being encouraged, by coaches, analysts, whoever it is, to get away from fastballs too soon? So in other words, like, it's a deteriorating quality of it over the course of years, so they bang it and they get away from it, instead of trying to right the ship. Like, what's the trend that you're seeing? Just because you and Matt Hinckley are talking to as many guys from different organizations each off season as anybody on the planet. So I'm curious if there's like a big picture perspective that you get from the 30,000 foot view.
It definitely depends on the organization for sure. But it's super individual, and I think it should be that way, because I think that there's like a lot of benefits for guys to continue to throw like a good amount of fastballs because they're really effective. Like, in preparation for this, was kind of looking through some of the guys who like do throw a lot of fastballs, and like looking at force teamers, like there's some guys who are really good who throw a ton of fastballs, like Liam Hendricks, Spencer Strider, Josh Hader, our guy Tristan McKenzie. Like they're really effective, and they still throw well over 55% fastballs in terms of like their overall usage. And so like I think it's really just dependent on one, like what the organization is pushing. There's some that have a pretty strong opinion on how they go about it. Some that kind of let guys do it the way they should, or do it the way they like want to. And then I think that there's just like the ability to like try and like look inward as a player, and from us as coaches, give like a little bit of like an outside looking in approach, where we can say, hey, like you do this really well, let's continue to do it, or we need to make an adjustment so you can make that next step in your career. So it's super individualized, I think.
I mean, you hinted at these guys who are, certain people who are getting away with a high percentage of fastball, obviously my bias, I think of Clay Holmes right away, and
Oh,
so curious.
he was on there too.
Yeah. So like what are, and granted, like you're talking about 55, 60%, that's still even maybe low compared to some of the other guys that we've encountered, historically, or, see a Bartolo Colon or Lance Lynn, or, they may be even higher than that. So I guess my question is, what are the outlier qualities that really make those heaters stand out? Like, are there things that, initially pop to mind, or is it a much, much bigger discussion? And we're obviously going to go down that rabbit hole, but maybe this is a good place to start.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think it's, at least I feel like nowadays it's pretty obvious, like, hey, the harder the pitch, the better, especially in terms of fastballs. But I think like people assume it's like, oh, it's got to be hard and have a lot of vertical break if it's a four seam, or a lot of horizontal break if it's a two seam. When in reality, there's a lot of other variables that go into account that can like define a good fastball. Like I think like looking at some of the guys that we said before, like Liam Hendricks, Strider, Hader, like they're all really, really flat approach angles. Like Hader's got a really funky like horizontal release point that gives a pretty funky like horizontal release angle. Clay Holmes, like he's more on the side of like a super steep approach angle where he can like where he is essentially like the opposite of like that flat heater going through the top of the zone. He's able to create more sink based off of the release point, the action the ball creates. It's all like one complete picture when you put all these different variables together. Tristan, like on the side of like honestly just deception, like the ball explodes out of his hand. It's really, really hoppy. He has a lot of vertical break. He spins it a ton. He throws it pretty hard to the top of the zone. It plays with his pitch mix. Like we just have to be able to decipher like it's more than one attribute than just like oh, it's a high vertical break fastball, it's good. It's more along the lines of like, oh, there's needs to be a couple things that like add up to the results that it produces.
I think that's the challenge is, like there's almost like a race to oversimplify things. You see somebody with a high spin fastball and immediately you want to just chase an even higher spin fastball and try to turn it into an elite four seam. We certainly see that over the course of time. And, there's, track records of pitchers who have literally just, gone in the wrong direction because they maybe chased something that was looked at to the exclusion of a lot of other qualities. So this may be the time to like, to beg the question, like what are the characteristics, if you had to like list them off for you, that you look at when you're trying to describe what a fastball is, and, obviously in turn, what can be done to optimize it?
Yeah. I mean, there's three like main definitive characteristics of a fastball, at least in my head. One, velocity is just how fast the ball is going. Movement, there's vertical break and there's horizontal break. Vertical is obviously up and down, horizontal side to side. The way that those movements are created are pretty interesting, but we'll save that for another conversation or later down as we get going. And then release point too, which I think is the most underappreciated piece of the fastball, because I think that everyone likes to see a lot of movement and a lot of velo, but like people don't tend to appreciate some of the quirkiness that comes from a low release height, or like someone who gets really, really far on one side or the other, the rubber, like the angle the ball comes out of their hand, how far down the slope they're releasing it. So release point, there's release height, release side, extension, and those are some of the like things that almost lead to like, we can call it deception or whatever we want, where like there's something that like a guy throws a fastball, nothing seems to be completely overbearing, and you're like, oh, I don't know why I can't hit that or why it's so effective. And all of a sudden you look, it's like, oh, he's releasing it from way over on the first base side at a really steep angle, or he's got a lower release point, or he's releasing it from like 53 feet instead of whatever 57, whatever it is. Like he's getting really far down the mound. Like there's just a lot of different funky variables that go into play that we don't necessarily, I feel like, appreciate at face value as much as we should.
So would you say the answer is it's to start a conversation of, hey, does your fastball play out more than you'd expect? Or B, does your fastball get hit when you expect it to be better than it is?
Yeah.
That's where it starts.
I mean, yeah, so, no, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so if that's the case, like what are the standards that you're going to use to measure, what's elite? Obviously, these things are interactive. A vertical approach angle works heavily with spin rate and extension and spin efficiency, all these things. Do you have certain standards that you like to use underneath these subcategories, or these three categories, I should say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, I think like first, like, elite's kind of like a subjective word for sure. Because like there's elite, like we talked about, in a vacuum, we see someone with elite spin or an elite movement profile. That's awesome, great for evaluating as well. But like there's an elite from an effectiveness standpoint as well. And I'm definitely probably more biased towards like the elite of the effectiveness standpoint, because when it comes to like professional baseball, that is what puts food on the table for sure. But like looking at like some of the like actual effectiveness like statistics and trying to be able to understand what makes someone elite, like looked at some correlations between so the statistics we have are velocity, reduced vertical break, horizontal break, extension, and both vertical and horizontal approach angles. And we use a couple of different things to like define effectiveness. Expected WOBA was one of them that I brought up earlier, like in a little bit more of an advanced version of batting average, where it takes into account like batted ball data, the launch angle, things like that. And then swing strike, which is the ability to create a swing and miss, and ability to like create a swing and miss in the zone, so zone miss. And so looking at like four seams, so if we separate from four seam fastballs and two seam fastballs, like the two biggest things that correlated to the effectiveness, like the better stats that we talked about, expected WOBA, swing strike, and zone miss, was vertical approach angle and velocity. And honestly, like I think I think the jig is up on vertical approach angle. It's pretty obvious now that we know, like, hey, if you have a pretty flat approach angle, like it's usually going to be pretty effective. But I think this just kind of gives us an idea of like, oh wow, it really does have such a significant role, especially when you're comparing it to like you think that like, oh, like a 4-seam fastball needs to have a lot of induced vertical break. It's a pretty low correlation to the effectiveness when you're looking at expected WOBA, the ability to create a swing and miss in general, and then just the ability to create a swing and miss in the zone as well. So I mean, I think like it's like looking at four seams, like velo and approach angles are definitely pretty big.
And approach angle is a tough one to impact too. Like so much of that is driven by the arm slot that they've just developed over the course of a career and are comfortable with, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where like the conversation of like we have to understand where they're coming from a physical evaluation standpoint, like what their like resting posture looks like, what kind of like range of motion they have in their hips and their T-spine, like what kind of ability do they have to like move through their hips in like a squat or a hinge position, like that's going to give us a really good idea as to like, okay, maybe we want to try and like, do we want to try and lower the slot? Do we want to try and throw the ball up in the zone more? Do we want to move on the rubber? Like those things are going to be super indicative of like where our parameters are for each guy. Just because as much as we want to like try and create like oh, a really flat approach angle, so let's drop the slot and move them over somewhere on the rubber, like it might not be capable of that. So that's got to be the first place we start with how we try and like affect some of these like these metrics that we want to affect.
And, I think you kind of hinted on the differences between four seams and two seams, and then even if we start to talk about this two seamers, like there are different types, right? Like you watch a game on TV and everything's called a sinker. In reality, they're running fastballs and they're true sinkers. Like, how do you evaluate what's taking place in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, like I agree with you. I think there's two different like justifications for two seams and sinkers. Because the two seams are a little bit more like running fastballs that like can sometimes play a little bit more up in the zone, and you can be a little bit more creative with those. But like the sinkers are the ones that are like demon whack down, like not a lot of vertical break, a pretty like steep approach angle. And so going into the way we evaluate those, there's similar idea: velo, vertical break, horizontal break, extension, and then approach angles. And then instead of expected WOBA, one that we used for the correlation was ground ball percentage, because I think like sometimes guys will smoke ground balls on two seams or sinkers, and they might go down as a negative in some of the batted ball data from a pitcher standpoint, but in reality, like kind of want to create more ground balls.
Yep.
And then also we'll compare it with swing strikes, the ability just to create swing and misses, and then zone miss, the ability to create swing and misses in the zone. And the biggest ones, like the ground ball, was vertical break in like the inverse correlation. So basically, the lower the vertical break, the more the ground balls. And the same idea with approach angle. The steeper, like the more steep the ball comes into the strike zone from a vertical approach angle, the better chance it has for ground balls. And then from a swing strike and zone miss standpoint, horizontal break had a half decent look into things, like where it gave us an idea of like okay, we want to create some swing and miss, we need to have some horizontal break on there. But a bigger one was extension, as well as horizontal approach angle as well. So like these are both like more, like we talked about before, like release point, like variables, like as opposed to like the pitch design or the effectiveness we're trying to create from our hand. So I think like it's an interesting look into things, and definitely harder to actively affect them. But I think that like when looking at like, okay, this guy throws a two seam or a sinker, what's going to matter more for us in terms of how we're evaluating what we might want to try and do. Like, as for example, if someone comes in for the off season and wants to like, oh, I need this pitch to get better.
Yep.
Where we're going to try and find out like, okay, was it actually bad? Was it not as good as you think it was? Or which way do we need to go? And like, we'll look into some of these things, and now we have a half decent idea of what correlates to success and what might correlate to be like, oh, like that might not be as good as we want it to be.
I think that's something like on the two seam discussion, particularly when you start to talk about like ground ball percentages, it opens a little bit of another can of worms, right? You have to also look at a hard hit percentage, right? Because a ground ball at 110 off the bat is a lot different than a ground ball at 80 off the bat. Something that can be, and on top of that, like there's more bad luck involved when balls put in play, right? You're going to have scenarios where maybe you have an underwhelming infield behind you, or the shift may get you, or things like that. So I think you have to look at a larger body of evidence and separate out whether they're just bad outcomes, or whether they actually are, scenarios where a pitcher is not controlling like the expected outcome. So see a lot of guys that, first month of the season, they feel like they're doing terribly. In reality, like the FIP is dramatically lower than the ERA, just because they've given up a lot of soft ground balls to holes and things like that.
Yeah, no, you see it all the time, and you see it from the other side of things too. You guys who start great, like from some of those like face value statistics, and all of a sudden things start to go down because like it's not exactly like the way it's supposed to be, quote unquote. But it's interesting.
You see the two seems get better as athletes advance from like the high school and the college ranks as well, because they're playing on better fields, they're playing with better defenders. Sometimes you see a guy who gets a lot of ground balls and all of a sudden he takes a big step forward just when the people behind him are actually good at baseball. So, and at the other end of the spectrum, like even just like standout high school kids, having a catcher you can trust. Like I've definitely, seen enough like high school first rounders over the years where it's like, it's a very big deal if you're a kid who's throwing 95, 96 in high school and you have a catcher who's just terrified to catch you. Like these are all things that impact, how things play up and what you can do with them and the confidence you can have in executing them.
It's 100%. We had someone come in actually recently into the gym who had that exact experience happen to him. High school ball, like he's a pretty like highly touted high school prospect going to Division I college, and he's like, yeah, it didn't pitch well. Like my catcher couldn't really handle me, and like defenders couldn't really field it. And then all of a sudden he got the summer ball and he pitched great, and he's like, oh, I'm good again.
Yeah, it's tough. So thus far we've kind of spoken about things that can be measured, but I think we both know there are things that can't be measured. Obviously, the industry is very different from a tech standpoint than it was 10 years ago. And we've gotten more and more objective measures. Above all else, right, is deception, whether that's, what you do in your delivery to have some funk, adjusting timing or anything like that, but also just hiding the ball well. How do you describe maybe an average fastball that plays up, simply, because of that deception? Like, is there any progress in that regard towards that, or is it just watching a ton of video and asking questions of hitters?
I mean, like the real answer is yeah, watching a lot of videos and talking to hitters and having a solid sample size to be able to make that assessment and that decision. But I mean, I think like more times than not, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Like guys who have pretty funky deliveries and like have something that's a little bit more unique from the way they move or the way that their physical assessment presents or like just the way they release the ball, like it's more times than not like it's a little funky. And if they show some success, they usually end up having the ability to like hold on to it for a little bit of time. So like I think like it's one of those things where like there's no good way to like actually define it. It's gonna be a lot more of like, okay, like this is an interesting look. He's got a little bit of a weird eval. He's gonna move a little bit funky. He's got some super flat feet, or like he's gonna compensate in this way or another way. Like those are the things that are gonna give us an idea of like, oh, he might have some unique qualities that we can embrace, and hopefully like that'll make up for something maybe not being as like elite in that initial vacuum we first talked about. And I think like one of the things that we can like kind of hit on in terms of like being able to evaluate it is something I've been looking into, and by no means are 100% confident in like the actual correlation of any of this, but it's something that's been really interesting are guys who have pretty similar release angles between like their fastballs and like their primary off speed pitch tend to have like a pretty good like chance of success, whether it's like vertical or horizontally, depending on the way the ball when they depending on the way the ball moves. It kind of almost quantifies like the way you think of like a curveball popping out of the hand or a slider being like too steep out of the hand if you're going to be throwing like if you're going to be throwing a two seam going the other way, like the way the ball comes out of the hand from an angle standpoint, not necessarily like the approach angle, but from the release angle, that kind of gives us a look as to like, oh, are they coming out in somewhat of a similar tunnel, similar way? Like you can have some variation between like release height and release side, but sometimes when there's too big of a difference in like the horizontal release angle or the vertical release angle, it kind of almost throws the hitter off. It was actually a really interesting conversation that we had with our hitting coordinator Wolfie. He was saying that we were trying to find a way to quantify tunneling, and like I don't know if there is any sort of way yet necessarily, but like if we can have an idea of like, oh, this ball is going to come out of your hand really, really similarly, like it's going to be pretty hard to differentiate between the two pitches.
Yeah, and I think even beyond that, there's no real true way to describe the fact that an average fastball can play up simply because hitters have to, respect an elite secondary offering. Like, we can agree that two pitches might come out of the same, release point or something very comparable, but, that doesn't mean that the pitches are inherently good. It just means that they're similar in how they present, but, the movement profiles and all that, obviously like a Kyle Hendricks changeup versus sinker is a good example. So I guess that's my next question is like, do you often see average fastballs that play up dramatically just because an elite secondary offering is so good, that it opened doors that a player might not otherwise have access to with an underwhelming 91-mile-an-hour heater?
Yeah, definitely, especially when like if we were talking about usage before, especially when the usage is kind of flipped around from those guys that we talked about earlier. When they're throwing a lot of, whether it be sliders or they're throwing a lot of changeups, or cutters or whatever their primary pitch is, it's really, really effective. Like all of a sudden you throw a fastball that looks pretty similar out of the hand, but might not be jump off the page metrically. It could be really, really effective just because guys aren't expecting it, and two have to protect against the other pitches.
I like it. So we've gotten maybe more granular with this. Let's take a step back and be a little bit more broad and talk about, how you get to these points. So when you sit down with a player, we're August 24th, we're recording this. So in the next, 6 weeks, you're going to be doing a lot of initial off-season consultations for our pro crowd. And I know you cover a lot in those meetings, but I'm curious, when you sit down with those folks to discuss, the outcomes of the season, all that stuff, and you start chatting about like an overall pitch package and how you might be able to optimize it moving forward, what do you think the key questions that you're asking? What's the information you're trying to acquire to effectively set the stage for a successful offseason?
Yeah, I mean, first off, just trying to get a feel for like the way that they like to hear or communicate, like the way that they give information, just so we can like set that groundwork of like how we want to talk to each other and like how this guy might like accept something a little bit better than another person from like an actual mental standpoint. But two, try and figure out what was good and what was bad, to be really, really blunt. We'll try and figure out like what things looked like when they were cruising, when things were going well, what things looked like when they were doing really poorly. Any sort of like subjective side of things where we can like kind of dive into like, oh, like this happened or that happened, that was why. So it gives us an idea of like, oh, we can get rid of that. We know why that wasn't good, or we can look at this and be like, oh, this is something we really want to dive into. And also like we'll look into their physical eval. They'll do at the gym, get a chance to look at like range of motion, like how their bodies reacted from like a big workload, small workload, depending on what they're coming off or from the season. And some different ideas from like a programming standpoint for how we want to handle their actual ramp up, like some drills, like some delivery things we want to pay attention to as the off season goes on. And that'll lead us into like the more like we said, granular idea of like the actual pitch package and their offerings. And so like we'll figure out what they currently throw, what was the best, what was the worst from off speed pitch standpoint. What do those pitches look like when they're good, when they're bad? Like where do you feel like your holes are? And then once we have a general idea as to like how they think their stuff is and what they think they need to do, we'll start to formulate an idea as to like, okay, like we'll look at like their year as a whole and be like, okay, where's like the lowest hanging fruit? Where can we actually like intervene and hopefully create a little bit more success? And if that's like adding a new pitch or if it's affecting another one, tinkering with some things, changing like focal points, we're trying to change where we're throwing it. We'll take it, and then once we find like that general idea where we want to go, we'll try and find a way like, oh, okay, like so we want to try and throw this kind of slider versus another one because it's pretty consistent. We'll take a look at like what does your wrist forearm anatomy kind of look like? What kind of stuff have you done in the past from like a injury standpoint? Like how have you handled different things along those lines? We start super broad and get even more granular as we go down, but it's a cool process because we get a chance to like really dive into a lot of different variables and get an idea as to like, okay, like how can we make this, take all of this information and funnel it down into like a simple understanding for the player so they can be like, oh, okay, I want to work on this. We're going to try this grip. I'm going to start it on November 15th.
Yeah. I love that you talked about, and there's a lot to unpack there, but one that jumped out at me, you talked about like wrist and forearm anatomy / function. Like, I do think that's a place where a lot of pitching coaches err. And we've obviously, endeavored to be different in that regard is that we want our pitching coaches to understand how the body works. Both you and Hinckley are practicing strength coaches before you were practicing pitching coaches. And I think that is vitally significant just because a lot of times we try to take like these pitch design and grip solutions to things that may actually be physical problems, that the hand is actually just being delivered in the wrong way because the rest of the body's not doing what it's supposed to, whether that's because of, some kind of upstream movement fault or just like an injury that may have predisposed people to not being able to get into the positions that they really need. So I love that, like, that's part of the discussion. I think it's something that has served us well as having like these physical evaluations, with our strength and conditioning staff and, looping in physical therapists where appropriate, you prior to actually going and chatting on the pitching side of things, because it just gives you a little bit more information to sort through as you're trying to, re-engineer, what previously was, or, build something that's new and, and unique in a good way.
Definitely. Gotta have a holistic approach for how we go about this.
Yeah. So let's talk about the tools of the trade. I mean, obviously we've talked about all these different metrics that we want, but what do you like to have at your disposal, from a technology standpoint when it comes to pitch design, particularly with respect to fastballs? What have you guys been using? I obviously see it, but it's good for our listeners to hear what you got, going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely. Currently we use mainly Rapsodo and Edgertronic. I think in a perfect world, we could have like TrackMan and Rapsodo, just because there's differences in the way that they're able to pick up different metrics. TrackMan does a really good job with picking up the movement, but Rapsodo gives us a really, really good look into how the ball is coming out of their hand. And honestly, I've grown accustomed to Rapsodo because it gives me and the pitcher like a visual of like how the ball is spinning, and that becomes a pretty easy way for us to try and like explain to them like, hey, your wrist is in this position, or this is the way the ball's coming out of your hand. Like, let's try and do this, or we need to go back down the chain. And like, if we're working on like something with their back foot, or the way that they're using their front side, like we can see like actual differences, and like, oh, maybe they cut this one a little bit, like they held their front side a little bit better, they're able to spin it cleaner. Little things like that where I've come to appreciate it. But I think in an ideal world we would have both, where we could actually see how the ball's spinning out of your hand, as well as the movement it's creating. We use the Edgertronic camera a decent amount, and that's been really useful from one, like just shortening the learning curve. I know Matt's talked about it in the past, but like when we can try and cue guys as much as we want to, but once they actually see the ball coming out of their hand to like in the direction that they're throwing it, it's like, oh, that makes a little bit more sense when they have an actual visual cue. And then from our side, like it gives us an idea of like how can we try and like formulate a way to communicate like, oh, we want you to do this with it. And then it gives us an idea of like, if maybe we want to see like where the seams are going, and if we want to change the grip, or how we want to try and impact that side of things. And then like even further down, like our markerless motion capture system, Thea, is really, really useful in the sense of just really kind of a lot of the things that we do. Like we can see variability between pitches if we want to try and compare like a fastball changeup, fastball slider. We can see like their different positions, rotational velocities, kind of the sequencing of their peaks of like the different main segments. And you just give us an idea of like how you move at that given time. Gives us a chance to understand the delivery, like just in relationship to the assessment, some of the positions that like you might get onto the table, and how that like presents when you're on the slope. Gives us an idea of like how to refer back to something where like if you're pitching in right before you go to spring training, call it February, and we get you on the system, we have a snapshot of what you look like, a super quantitative version of like, hey, like this is what you look like, you're in a great spot, like this is our benchmark, and we know where to go from there. And it can give us an idea as to like some of the training interventions, throwing programming, like give us an idea of like, oh, okay, you create velocities in this way, like you're really good at creating you're really good at decelerating, you're really good at creating power, you're super loose, you can get in some pretty extreme positions. Like this just gives us an idea of like, okay, this is what you do, and this is how we can either like aim to improve those strengths, combat some of the things that don't look necessarily great, especially if they don't like go in line with your evaluation. And it's been a really cool opportunity for us to dive into some really interesting things, especially with our population here at the gym.
Yeah. I think that's the secret, is you layer various technological initiatives, and then you create a level of synergy across departments. And that's where things get exciting, is you appreciate that, some of those technologies, we might have thought that they only applied to, what pitching coaches could do, but in reality, they're actually giving direct feedback to some of our strength and conditioning coaches about the programs they write. So it's all about knocking down those silos and, taking advantage of every resource you have to help the athlete. So I think we've kind of biased this conversation towards the professional side of things, maybe a little bit more. But I guess my question would be like, how does this differ for amateur players? What's the lowest hanging fruit for our youth, our high school, our college players, as they want to develop better fastballs?
Yeah, we definitely have trended on the pro side, but I think there's a lot to take away from a more amateur side as well. And I think in the most simplistic way possible, like I think in intent and athleticism is more times than not the lowest hanging fruit, especially with the day and age where like information is so accessible these days. Where like you can go on YouTube and find any pitching mechanic breakdown of any guy you've ever seen, the pitch grip of how anyone throws their slider, curveball, changeup, 2-seam, 4-seam, whatever it is. Like we end up getting pretty internally focused, and then even higher up into some of the like college or like higher level amateur ranks, like we put a really big focus on whether it's throwing strikes or we need to control the running game, stuff like that. All are great things for us to do, but like I think sometimes what happens is we lose the ability to like be like, oh, I'm going to be an athlete, I'm going to throw this fastball really hard with some intent through the catcher's mask or through the catcher's glove, I mean, and we're going to keep the athleticism factor in there. it's kind of surprising how many guys that like come into our facility. It's just like, especially it's like the lower levels. It's like, hey, like I want you to have fun and be an athlete. Like you're gonna remember when you played shortstop and you let it rip to first base and you didn't think about anything. Like that's the way I want you to do it, and it creates such a nice snowball effect of like they start to move a little bit better. They start to free their body up. Their mind gets a little bit more at ease. They're able to throw more strikes. It's been like a really basic tool, but it's been super, super useful, especially for a younger population. And the other side of it is just embracing some of the unique things that they do. Kind of like, again, like the same idea, like information super accessible. Like I think we have a false idea of like everything is like there's one way to be efficient or right, or to be like to have good mechanics, when there's so many different ways that we can be effective, and to throw hard, to throw strikes, to get a lot of people out. And more times than not, like you look at, like you watch TV for a summer and watch some of these games that are going on at the big league stadiums, like you see a lot of like really, really unique deliveries, releases, like different ways that they go about it. Like, and I know we're spoiled down here because we get a chance to see them up close and personal, but I think people forget like a lot of these guys, they like did something a little funky when they were younger. They kept doing it. Someone gave them a cue here, cue there, and all of a sudden, like they do something that not very many people do, and it's unique. So like I think from a younger standpoint, just like if we can be athletic and throw with intent and embrace some of the unique things that you do, obviously bearing like some health factors and stuff like that, but like embracing some of the things you do that are a little different, I think they can go a long way.
I love that. And, but I do think there's kind of like the pendulum that swings too far, right? We certainly see like the kids that come in with the carrot in front of the horse, or sorry, so the carriage in front of the horse, not the carrot in front of the horse, where they're just, it's easy to get access to high level information, right? And it's easy to get caught up in thinking that you need some of these advanced strategies, or try to basically reproduce a delivery that you're not capable of getting to. So do you find yourself on a daily basis, like having to constantly pull back some of those really like high motivation, high knowledge, but sometimes low skill athletes who aren't quite ready to take that on?
Oh, 100%. Like it's like we said, like everything's so accessible. Where like we have guys coming in that understand and want to get better and like have the tools to do it, and sometimes it gets in the way, just because there's so much that they're trying to do or trying to accomplish within one day, when it's about like one, like from a overall stress standpoint, being able like to let our body like handle what we're doing from a stress standpoint, not doing too much, allowing ourselves recover, and so that we can continue to adapt and move from there. And also like a mental side, like you want to talk about like grinding ourselves into the ground, always like trying to do something to get better. Like it can affect our CNS, it can affect our overall morale. Like if we're just such a high motor, like pushing it every single little bit, not giving ourselves a chance to be like, okay, I'm gonna work on this. I did it, good, let's move on. So yeah, all the time. But I think again, like it's finding that sweet spot, because some guys need a little bit more information, motivation, like what they're working on. Some guys need to be like, hey, do this one thing and then don't do anything else.
Yeah.
So it's a case by case situation for sure.
I love that. All right. So we always wrap up with a lightning round. So I'm gonna throw a few at you. So first off, lessons to we'll call it a teenage Matt Ellmyer. And if you want, you can also think of college pitcher Matt Ellmyer. What would you say?
Trust yourself, for sure. Trust yourself and believe in the things you did in the past, because you're going to be just fine.
Nice. What's one book that every player should read?
Every player. I think player, I really enjoyed 90% Mental. That one was one that I read like as a player, and kind of like gave me some direction and some things. I gotta give a shout out to our pitching coach at Wofford. We did weekly mental performance meetings, and we read the mental ABCs of pitching, which were really, really cool excerpts that we enjoyed.
Yeah.
But yeah, those two were huge.
Bob Tewksbury, previous podcast guest, and an absolute awesome dude. So good little shout out there. How about a book that every coach should read? What's impacted you more as you've transitioned into coaching?
Range. And you got to forgive me because I don't remember who wrote it, but and you might have honestly suggested it before. But I've read it. I want to say like a year or two ago, and
David Epstein.
Yeah, and it was a really, really cool, like, one, just like outlook on like, hey, like having an idea of a lot of different things and being able to connect those dots, like, was really interesting. And two, I think it like gave me some confidence in some of the stuff that I've done as I've been like getting older and growing and getting better as a coach, like that, like having like some different experiences and ideas can really be beneficial.
So you've been a CSP athlete, both as a high school and a college player. You've now been a coach at CSP as well. You've got experience in professional baseball. And so we have a lot of kids and parents who I think can benefit from that multifaceted, experiences. So if you could give some advice to, the teenage kid and parents that are in the car, driving from one game to go out to dinner, or, they're going to practice, listen to this together. What would the advice you give to them be?
Don't stop enjoying it. Because I think like as kids get older and as like players get better, and especially from a parent standpoint, it almost turns into something that's more of a job than but it isn't yet. They're still playing a game. And I think like not letting it like get away from the fun side of things and like focusing on like the big picture. Like I think that like we get very caught up in the showcase or tournament right in front of us, or this past season or this season coming up. But like I think obviously like they matter, but I think that understanding like, hey, this is a big picture. It's a long road. If we can do something that's going to benefit me or benefit like the player for like multiple years, multiple seasons, like when they're 15, and we can do something that's going to benefit them when they're 18, like that usually ends up being a little bit more fruitful, as opposed to really pushing to try and make that one thing right in front of us amazing. So I think like hold on to the fun of it, because I think it's easy to become a job, and just look at it as a big picture. There's no end all be all in the next summer, even the next like year, probably for most guys. There's a lot of guys that can do really, really well over a long course of time, but it's just continued consistency, like being able to be disciplined in what you're doing.
I like it. And then the last question, I'm actually really curious. What rattles around your brain at 3 a.m.? What gets you excited right now? Like, what's next frontier in the context of developing pitchers that makes you really intrigued right now?
There's a lot of things for sure.
You're a curious guy. That's what I love about you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the biggest ones is like the more we get into the biomechanics, like the more we have an idea of like just how people move, the different compensations that they have. Like I think we can't think of like, oh, if someone's gonna throw hard, they're good in every single like category or measurable that we can pull from some of these mocap sessions. Like it's trying to understand like, okay, what does their physical eval look like? What is their history in terms of injury, pitching, delivery, focuses, and then what does like their mocap stuff look like? And then we can try and like figure out like where their holes are, where we want to leave things alone. It's something that I feel like I stare at sometimes for hours, and then I'm just like, ooh, I think I have something, but I actually have no idea. That's a huge one. I think the biggest one, at least moving forward, I think is massive. But it definitely keeps me up. I mean, one of our, our former pitching coordinator, Mark, I texted him at midnight one time, just asking questions.
That's what it's
funny,
about.
No.
It's about staying curious and always trying to like push things higher and take things to higher ground. So, and I think this podcast did just that, hopefully for a lot of our listeners. Awesome stuff. You got a great presence on social media. It's at Matt Ellmyer on Twitter. And then most of your stuff on the pitching side is probably under the CSP Florida pitching umbrella on Instagram. That's at CSPFL_pitching. You and Hinckley are always uploading some good stuff. So Matt, appreciate you taking the time and sharing some wisdom, and look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.